Jonas Larsson, YouTuber from Denmark. I was listening to an interview the other day with the great American intellectual Francis Fukuyama, and he quoted a phrase from one of his books, which was "getting to Denmark." And this refers to the idea that in some ways Denmark represents sort of the pinnacle of human civilization. Do you think that Danish people think this way about themselves?
Yes, yeah. This is definitely part of sort of the identity of Denmark. You know, you hear Danes talk all the time about having one of the best welfare systems. You hear Danes talk about how we're one of the happiest countries in the world, one of the lowest rates of inequality. But I don't think that any Dane would say, you know, we're done here. This is a perfect society, just like you get in any country. But I definitely think there is a slight smugness about just how well things tend to go in Denmark.
So what do Danish people stereotypically complain about?
The weather for one thing, but societally, it's, you know, everyone's always, just like in any country, there's a long series of things that the government does that people are unhappy with. Right now we have a prime minister who is very divisive, and a government generally, which is very divisive. So it's, you know, it's either political scandals or it's a economically liberal shift that's been going on in Denmark essentially since the 90s, even slightly before then. And that rubs a lot of Danes the wrong way. Aside from that, you know, it's the same problems that you get in other countries. People wish that public services were better. People wish that the prices of food, for example, right now, inflation is hitting Denmark just like in any other country. But, you know, things aren't that bad.
How is it that you speak English so well?
Well, I've spent quite a lot of my life outside of Denmark. Throughout my childhood, my family moved around quite a lot. I spent 5 years living in China, 7 years living in the States, and then I went to university in the UK. So, you know, just picking up English along the way, always going to international schools. That's why I have sort of a bit of a strange accent. Some people call it the international student accent, which is somewhere between European English and North American English.
Can you speak any other languages?
Just English and Danish, a little bit of Spanish, and I'm currently taking lessons in Greenlandic.
You had a video on Danish local elections where you were talking with some guy who was mayor of one of the cities over there, and you were speaking, you know, fluent English to him. How common would you say that is with the Danish political class? Could we just grab a random Danish politician and expect to have a fluent English conversation with him?
Yeah, more or less. The guy I spoke to, his English was particularly good, but I think you could grab pretty much any Danish person off the street and expect to have a conversation with them in English with very little difficulty. And that's just part of English being something that's taught in schools from a very young age. And then especially with young people in Denmark, it's something that they are just exposed to online. You get this weird phenomenon of young Danish people sometimes speaking better English than Danish sometimes, just because they spend so much time online, you know, playing video games with people in other countries and watching YouTube and TV shows in English.
So where did you go to school, and what other jobs have you had other than YouTuber?
I went to school at an international school in China for some years. Then I went to a public school in the US for a couple of years and spent a year in an American high school. Then I went to a boarding school in Denmark for the majority of my high school time. And then I went to university in Glasgow in Scotland. And then jobs I've had since I graduated from university, I worked a couple of years in Scottish politics. So first I worked a year as a campaign manager for the Scottish Conservatives going into the 2024 general election in the UK. And then I spent a year working in the Scottish Parliament for a member of that Parliament.
You can work for the Scottish government even though you're not Scottish?
Yeah. There's actually a surprising amount of internationals who work in British politics. I don't really know why, but just sort of a strange little phenomenon. Maybe something to do with how interesting it is and the fact that, you know, everyone outside of the UK follows British politics to some extent.
In your video explaining Danish politics, you mentioned that there are currently 12 different political parties in Denmark. And why is it that Denmark, which is a country with just 6 million people, has so many political parties?
That's an excellent question. I think part of it is the low threshold. All you need to be elected into parliament is 2% of the vote. So that helps to bring up the number quite a bit. And then there's been a phenomenon in the last decade or so with a political fragmentation. Not polarization in the same way you see in the US, for example, but where people have come to just realize and expect that there's a party that caters more specifically to them than they were maybe used to decades before. You've seen the splintering of, especially one of the big parties has essentially splintered into 3 different parties. And you see a tendency where voters are just a lot more prone to jump from party to party from election to election. So someone who may have voted for the Social Democrats throughout their whole life is now all of a sudden realizing, maybe next time I'll vote for the Green Left, or I'll vote for the Social Liberals, or I'll vote for a party even further to the left, like the Red-Green Alliance. And that's something a lot of political scientists have been picking up on and talking about the last few years.
Another thing that struck me about that video was how you referred to the parties of the right as being liberal parties. Why is it that Europeans think of liberals as being on the right when we on this continent think of liberals as being on the left?
Yeah, it's something I often get a lot of comments on from American viewers as well, where, you know, in Europe, liberal tends to be this classical liberal small state idea where, you know, liberal means lower taxation, less regulation, less government spending, where the flip side of that is the social policy, where you've got sort of the idea of social liberalism. And these normally go hand in hand in Europe, where you've then also got, you know, very pro-immigration, very pro-LGBT policy. And then I think in North America, especially in the US, you've had so much focus on the social policy maybe that liberal has just been tied up into this idea of being left-wing and socially liberal more than with regards to the economic policy.
What is Midsummer?
Midsummer is a Swedish phenomenon, I believe, where they celebrate, I think it's the summer solstice. And there's a lot of sort of lore and mythology around it. I've never been to a midsummer celebration in Sweden, but I've seen some, people can go look this up, I've seen some quite fascinating videos of some of the things that they tend to do and the traditions around it, the traditional dress. And I think there's this interesting dance that they form around this pole with some ribbons and stuff. Really interesting, but not something I know all that much about.
Really? Because I was reading about it on the Danish government's website about Danish culture, and this was mentioned as some sort of big Danish thing. But you're sort of saying it's only in Sweden? Yeah,
definitely, mostly in Sweden. We have another tradition in Denmark around summertime. This might have been what it was referring to, which we call Sankt Hans, where we do this. We go normally to a beach, and you have this massive bonfire where you burn a witch. That's also something we do in Denmark come summertime. That's sort of our version of it. Historically, you did tend to burn a woman you thought was a witch. Today, thankfully, it's normally just a doll you throw in there.
Can you tell me about a very Danish tradition that you have some happy childhood memories of?
We do quite a lot, and we make quite a big deal out of Christmas. And we celebrate it in quite a interesting way, where we always celebrate Christmas in Denmark on the eve of the 24th. So for us, the big Christmas day is the 24th. It's Christmas Eve. Christmas Day is much more just what you in the UK would call Boxing Day, which is just relaxing and eating leftovers. But so on Christmas Eve, it's a big feast and you open presents. And then you have this thing you call dancing around the Christmas tree, where everyone stands around the Christmas tree, everyone holds hands, and then you walk around the Christmas tree singing Christmas songs. And we call it dancing around the Christmas tree. It's much more just walking around the Christmas tree singing. From an outsider perspective, it looks like a cult, but when you're in it, it's lovely. And I don't know what it is. It's just nice and comfortable, and what we in Denmark call hygge.
Who brings the presents to the children in Denmark?
Santa Claus does. And our Santa Claus lives on Greenland, not the North Pole. That's a little funny quirk of Danish Christmas lore as well. And what you actually normally get on Christmas Eve is you get a person, a family member, normally maybe a grandfather or an uncle, who dresses up like Santa Claus and who then comes into the house and gives all the kids presents instead of, having it in stockings, for example.
What's your favorite Danish food these days?
Oh, that's a good question. What is my favorite Danish food? I mean, the traditional answer, and this is something I rejected for some reason as a child, but I've come to really appreciate, is our Danish traditional meatballs, which we call frikadeller. I don't think they're all that different from meatballs from other countries, but I think it's a very European thing where your type of meatball is culturally unique. But yeah, that and then a nice gravy, boiled potatoes. That's a nice classic Danish dinner.
Why is the 1870s so important for Danish history?
The 1870s is in large part where Danish electoral politics really takes off, where you get the working class in Denmark really start getting a lot more powers. And you can trace a lot of Danish parties back to this period. And it's a time where the royal family also starts losing a lot of their influence, and where you just get this big cultural societal shift towards a much more egalitarian progressive state. And I think that's where this idea that you started the podcast with, where that really starts, where the slow process to getting to where we are today, where Denmark's a country that's looked up to quite a lot, where that kind of takes off.
What exactly is Scandinavia?
Well, that depends on who you ask. If you ask a Dane, a Swede, or a Norwegian, it is Denmark, Sweden, or Norway. And it sort of has its roots back in the Calmar Union. If you ask someone from Finland or Iceland, they might also include themselves in that. That can be a bit contentious, but from a Danish perspective, it's those three countries that were in the Calmar Union.
What was that?
So the Calmar Union was, I don't know if I remember the specific years, but it was maybe the 14th, 15th, or 16th century, where you had the three countries after, hundreds and hundreds of years of being at war with one another, essentially coming together under one crown. And it was a fairly peaceful period for a couple hundred years. And I think that is very much historically seen as this period of time where the Scandinavian culture is really created. A degree of a shared language. If you're a Dane in Norway, you can normally speak Danish to a Norwegian, they can answer back in Norwegian, and that's fine. You can sort of get by on a conversation like that. Swedish as well to some degree. And I think a lot of that, both linguistically but also culturally, the assimilation between the three countries has its roots in that period.
I'm looking at a picture right now of two puppet characters that are supposedly very beloved in your country. One is a green frog, and the other one is a blue bird, and they sort of look like Muppets. So what is this?
That is Kai and Andrea. That's an old Danish children's television program. I think it's quite old, but it's the type of thing I think children grow up with it today still. It's still shown on TV. And it's essentially just this, I think episodes were very, very short, and it's just this cute little puppet show between those two characters. We have quite a lot of puppet programs in Danish children's television lore. And you get new ones all the time as well. And the other interesting thing culturally about that is the kite, which is the name of the frog, has a cake named after him, a kite cake, which in most bakeries you can go in and you can see this little cake decorated like a frog, and it's essentially just sort of marzipan and a few other things. Very, very sweet, designed for children, but this weird little byproduct of that quite big Danish children's show.
You're how old?
I'm 25.
I was surprised to learn that the population of Copenhagen is not quite as big as I expected, just over 500,000 people. So where are some of the other places that everybody's living?
Denmark has essentially four big cities, big-ish cities. So I live in the city called Aarhus, which is the second largest. A city on Jutland, which is the peninsula that sort of juts out from Germany. You've got a city like Odense as well, which is a quite historically famous city for being the birth city of Hans Christian Andersen. Then you've got the city of Aalborg, which is very famous for the schnapps that's made there, and which is sometimes exported to a lot of other countries.
Schnapps? I don't know what that is.
Oh, that's a type of shot, one of our sort of classic Danish alcoholic drinks. You drink it during Christmas time, when you have, Christmas dinners, for example, you'll normally have shots of schnapps with it as well. And then in terms of where other people live as well, Denmark has a bunch of towns spread all across the country. It's actually one of the countries with the least amount of nature, least amount of preserved nature. So the vast majority of Denmark is either fields and farms, or it is towns, cities and houses.
What were your parents doing that had you move around the world so much?
My dad is an engineer. He works with wind turbines, which is another sort of big Danish cultural export. And he just had some cool opportunities to take that to other countries. And so I think my parents sort of fell in love with that lifestyle of just moving from country to country and exploring different cultures. And that's something that's sort of rubbed off on me as well, which is why when I was going to go to university, I decided, I'm going to look out with Denmark and decided to go to Scotland.
The polling data seems to suggest that Denmark might be one of the very least religious countries in the whole world, even less religious than other Scandinavian places. Where does that come from?
I don't know if I know exactly where it comes from, but it's definitely something you feel in Denmark. The church fills very, very little, even in sort of rural, small town parts of Denmark. I mean, there are definitely parts that are more religious than other parts, but I don't think you come across areas that are really, really religious. I don't really know where it comes from, but something that's quite interesting is that there's a lot of talk, and there has been the last year or so, about a bit of a religious revitalization, especially amongst young people starting to re-find religion and Christianity. So I think that might actually be a trend and a statistic that, cut to a decade from now, Denmark's no longer one of the least religious countries in the world.
What was your family's religious situation like?
We were very a-religious. We, went to church every once in a while for special occasions. Parts of the family go to church on Christmas Eve before we have dinner. But other than that, not really.
It's Lutheran, right? That's the big religion in Denmark?
Yeah. Denmark was one of the first countries to really turn fully Protestant.
Before Donald Trump started making all of these noises about wanting to take over Greenland, how often did the topic of Greenland come up in Danish politics?
Very rarely. And that's also a criticism that the Danish political elite are facing a lot right now. Greenland seems to be something that comes up either when it's under threat or when it helps the Danish political class get into rooms that the leaders of a small country like Denmark might not otherwise be invited to. So there is also a lot of societal issues in Greenland that have gone ignored. I think in early 2025, when the first of these waves of Greenland conflict really erupted, a lot of Danes, myself included to some degree, realized that, we know very little about this country, and then started researching it, and the news started covering stuff like Greenlandic politics all of a sudden. But before then, Greenland was something, you might learn a little about in primary school, you learn a little bit about the culture, about the history, and then you don't really touch it again in your, high school years, your adult life. The news doesn't really deal with it that much.
You made a video recently where you were talking about the whole Greenland crisis, and you were talking about some of the leading political figures over in Greenland. And you mentioned how the woman that is now the Greenland foreign minister, in the past, she had not wanted the Danish prime minister to come to Greenland. And that kind of stood out to me because it suggested that sort of the relationship between Greenland and Denmark had not been very good in the past.
Yeah, the relationship between Greenland and Denmark ebbs and flows quite a bit. And there's also big differences between different Greenlandic politicians. Some are quite, and have historically been quite Denmark positive. Others are a lot more skeptical of Denmark. And so the foreign minister in Greenland, Vivian Motzfeldt, she's one of these people who historically has been quite prickly around Denmark. She's and quite critical of Denmark. And so what happened was, this was in early 2025, actually. This was after the first wave of Trump-Greenland crisis conflict. The new Greenlandic government had just been elected and formed, but it hadn't been officially sworn in. But the Danish Prime Minister was still going to come up and visit, and Vivian Motzfeldt then made the argument that, you know, Greenland had been very upset about J.D. Vance having traveled to Greenland at a very politically turbulent time for Greenland. So why was it okay for the Danish Prime Minister to travel up there before this new government was formally sworn in? Almost treating Denmark with the same degree of animosity that she had treated the US with during a period where they'd really been threatening. This also led to a lot of internal turmoil, and the Prime Minister of Denmark still came up. And I think even Vivian Motzfeldt, after this newest wave, has softened on Denmark. I think that's been the big trend of January 2026, is Greenlandic politicians who have been skeptical of Denmark for years have started to think, you know, we rely on Denmark to protect us from the US at this point. And I think there's maybe also been a little degree of recognition that Danes have started treating Greenland with more respect than Denmark has historically, which I think has also warmed a lot of people in Greenland to Denmark.
What are the Faroe Islands?
Yeah, so the Faroe Islands are sort of the third part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So you've got, you know, the mainland Denmark, you've got Greenland, and then the Faroe Islands. These were islands that were originally part of the Norwegian kingdom many centuries ago, and then sort of when kingdoms were changing hands throughout, you know, some turbulent periods in Scandinavian history, they end up in Danish possession, and in a lot of ways they have very similar constitutional arrangements as Greenland does, where they've got quite a high degree of home rule and self-government. But they're a small cluster of islands northwest of the Shetland Islands in Scotland. I think it's about 56,000 people live there. It's some very hilly, very geographically beautiful islands. I've never been, but I'd love to go, and I know a fair few people from the Faroe Islands. And yeah, it's just a small island community. And the interesting thing, going back to the religious aspect, is that's probably the most religious part of Denmark. The Faroe Islands are very, very religious, which stands in quite stark contrast to the rest of the kingdom.
If you wanted to go there, can you like get a direct flight? How inaccessible are they?
Yeah, so even though geographically it wouldn't seem too logical, there are direct flights from Denmark both to the Faroe Islands and to Greenland.
I feel like if there's one thing about Danish politics that people outside of Denmark are aware of, it's that immigration has been a very hot issue over there, and that there is some sort of right-wing anti-immigration party that's been doing increasingly well. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yep, so immigration has been a mainstay of Danish politics since the 90s, really. First, you have this anti-immigration National Conservative Party that really becomes successful in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then all the way up through to the sort of mid-2010s, called the Danish People's Party. And they've really been able to set the political agenda in Denmark to the point where I think they've moved the Overton window to such a degree that Social Democrats in Denmark, their traditional center-left party, would be seen as incredibly hardline on immigration in any other European country. At least it would have a couple of years ago, before I think a lot of other European countries have started this shift as well. But this, especially in the 2010s, led to some quite bad headlines for Denmark in the international press. The Guardian famously drew this cartoon of the Danish Prime Minister at the time, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, dressed up as Hitler, which we weren't too pleased with in Denmark. But I think now, today, there's also a little bit of smugness in Danish politics about we took on this very hardline view on immigration early on politically in Denmark. A lot of countries in Europe now are only just getting to this point, whereas in Denmark, we don't really have this big national conservative movement that you have in the UK or in Sweden or in Germany or in France, because the mainstream parties have just adopted the policies and essentially kept the national conservatives from power.
Where are the immigrants coming from?
It is, today it's primarily the Middle East. It's Syria, it's Afghanistan, that sort of part. I think those are two of the biggest countries that immigrants come from. I think there are a lot of Turkish immigrants as well. And then in the last couple of years, we've also taken quite a few Ukrainian refugees. But there has been some growing criticism now from the National Conservatives that there's been this whole idea of Denmark being a hardline country on immigration, but that maybe the data doesn't quite back that to the same extent. So I think even then you still do get a lot of people who realize that their communities are becoming a lot more ethnically diverse than they had been previously. And this has sort of rekindled the immigration debate, which seems to be rekindled every couple of years or so anyways, but which has now also led to the Social Democrats trying to take yet another step rightwards on immigration in a big announcement they made just a couple of days ago.
You referred to this a little bit earlier, but there was a book, a very popular book about Danish culture that sold very well around the world, and it was about a concept called hygge.
Yeah, hygge.
What is that?
So hygge is something that we in Denmark say there's no word for in any other language. Essentially, it means coziness, comfiness. It's the it's kind of dark outside. You light a little candle. That's hygge. It's sitting by the fireplace. That's hygge. But hygge can also be, it's the middle of the summer, you're standing on a beach drinking a beer, that's hygge, or a family barbecue, that's hygge. It's quite difficult to describe, but I think it's the idea of coziness and being with friends and family and warmth and happiness. And it's something that, it's another one of our big sort of cultural exports. That the little book of hygge, I think it's called, is a massive bestseller internationally. And it's the type of thing, you get tourists coming to Denmark looking for the hygge, which we're also quite fond of in Denmark, that this is a little thing that we can sell as part of brand Denmark.
Back in 2003, I was a big supporter of George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. And I remember it was considered important for supporters of that war to point out that Bush, wasn't going it alone, that he actually had many European allies on his side. And I remember one of his European allies was this guy called Anders Fogh Rasmussen. What can you tell me about him, and what does it mean that he was supporting Bush?
Well, Anders Fogh Rasmussen was prime minister for a period in I think it was from 2001 through to 2009, maybe. He was one of the sort of very big, decisive figures in recent Danish political history. He was a very, very big internationalist. He would resign as prime minister in, I think it was 2009, might have been slightly before, slightly later. But that was to take on the job of Secretary General for NATO. And very much because he built these big international relations with the US, for example, by showing Danish support for the US following 9/11, with both the invasion of Afghanistan and then later Iraq. He was also the first Danish prime minister to really allow the National Conservatives to have influence. He worked quite closely with the Danish People's Party, never letting them join a coalition government, but starting that big transition of Denmark becoming a quite hardline country in terms of immigration. I think those are the two things that he's probably the most famous for, is very internationalist, but also very hardline on immigration.
Is he still around today?
Today he's mostly he'll go on TV every once in a while to give an interview on some big international happening. He gave a big one in terms of the new Greenland crisis. But aside from that, he's got a company. I think it's quite similar to what Tony Blair has done after he was Prime Minister of the UK, where he goes out and he advises different international governments and companies using his expertise and international connections. So he's not really in the political scene anymore. He's much more of a businessman, lobbyist, TV personality type.
And the woman who is Prime Minister now, what is she like?
Mette Frederiksen, she's the leader of the Social Democrats. She's quite a stern politician. She's led Denmark through some pretty big crises. First, the COVID crisis, then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then all, essentially 3 waves, if you'd call it that, of this US Greenland crisis. She's very tough, and she presents herself as someone who can weather the storm of a crisis. This was first very big during COVID, and today that's sort of the foundation of her government, the one that she currently runs. Aside from that, she's also the person who took the Social Democrats through the big ideological shift in the period between 2015 through 2019, where she really turns immigration into something that the Social Democrats care a lot about from a hardline view on immigration perspective. She was initially quite a left-leaning type of politician on the economy, but that's something she's sort of swung back and forth. Now she's a bit more liberal, but trying to swing back more to sort of a left-wing social democratic view on the economy. But I think the big things she's known for is crisis management and hardline on immigration.
What was her job before she became a politician?
I think she's very much a career politician. I don't think she had any job before that. I think there's a big tradition in Danish government and Danish politics of, you have these people at teenage age, they join the youth wings of parties, and then they work their way up through the youth wing of a party, and then they start standing for various electoral positions. So a lot of the politicians currently in the Danish parliament know each other from their teenage years, from having been in youth politics together, which is very much, I think, a Scandinavian thing, that there's that much emphasis on youth politics and politicians having that youth experience. But it also means that the idea of having someone come in from the private sphere into Danish politics is a lot rarer than in a lot of other countries.
I remember learning somewhere that the former Queen of Denmark, how do you say the name? Margaret? Margaret?
Margrethe.
Margrethe. The English version would be Margaret, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember she just stepped down recently. And I remember learning that she was quite the compulsive smoker. What do you think it means that I know that?
I mean, there's an interesting thing in terms of Danish public health, where smoking is much less taboo than it is in a lot of other developed Western countries. Our current foreign minister as well, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, is a famous smoker. You see him all the time out meeting people while he's walking around smoking a pipe. And I think there's also a slight link back to hygge. A lot of people associate a smoke with hygge. And the Queen, just like the foreign minister, just like many other prominent Danes, is just a big smoker, likes a cigarette because it's hygge.
Who was the Queen married to, and how many children did she have? So
she was married to, I'm blanking on his name. It was a Frenchman, and he wasn't particularly admired in Denmark. I think he was quite... He never really bothered learning Danish or filling a lot of the roles that you'd expect from a royal. And together they had, I believe it's 2 children, the king today, and then his younger brother.
Who's the most controversial member of the Danish royal family?
We don't really have that many controversial figures in the Danish family. I don't actually think we've got anyone who you could call controversial. There's been a little bit of drama around the king. A lot of foreign media have been reporting on an alleged affair that he's had. Danish media aren't quite buying that. And then his younger brother, Joachim, has also had a bit of a public spat with his mother about his children losing their royal titles, which she seemed to do in her last year as queen to try to shrink the royal family a little to keep it quite close-knit.
Do you ever think about living somewhere else? I know you already have in the past, but do you think you'll leave Denmark again?
Yeah, probably. I like the idea of moving around and exploring new cultures, and just about getting settled somewhere before deciding it's time to move on to somewhere else. In just a couple months, I'm actually going to move for half a year to Greenland. That's technically within the confines of the Kingdom of Denmark, but I'm going to do a study abroad semester in Greenland to try to get the sense of what it's like there. But I definitely see myself in the future moving around the world, different times as well.
Jonas Larsson, YouTuber from Denmark. Thank you very much.
Thank you.